just to make a few disclaimers, like everybody else, I have had my training in continental philosophy, and I did my master's in literature. And like as you know, while during my education, our department had a very strong post-colonial emphasis, and also the post-structuralist readers, post-structuralist thinkers that I was reading, I found them themselves moving to ancient and medieval philosophers to sort of find new conceptual tools to rethink the theoretical impasses. And that made me decide to sort of work on Indian philosophy in my PhD. And like the motivation behind that is partly personal because you also want to figure out how did we historically get here in India, like what this is, you want to think the historical predicament which we are in, but also I feel more importantly that the pre-modern philosophy and pre-modern religion is basically it's philosophy, it's a lot of things, like it's not just only religion. It provides like new conceptual tools. For instance, like emphasis on non-being in religion. It provides very useful tools for thinking subject beyond humans, like beyond anthropocentric humans. So there's that. I'm also interested in philosophy of mind, but it's an uncharted territory for me. So please forgive me if I make mistakes. The paper is divided into 4 sections. The first section will basically be a reiteration of what has been covered, but it will help me contextualize the paper which I'm responding to. So I'll just begin. Am I audible properly? Okay. With the sharp criticism of mind-body dualism in the philosophy of mind, various kinds of physicalism emerged within the discipline, most of which identify the conscious states with brain states. The physicalist and the dualist view presuppose an acute difference between conscious beings, which is humans and few animals, and non-conscious entities such as elementary life, objects, and things. This view, however, has been highlighted as problematic and insufficient across various quarters. Apart from the difficult issue of explaining the emergence of consciousness from inert matter, the emphasis on time consciousness and lived experience in phenomenology, just Husserl, Heidegger, and Fink, as the fundamental aspects of being problematize the physicalist conceptions of mind. Moreover, the sharp distinction between animate and inanimate life has been demonstrated within deconstruction as untenable and ultimately maintained by a cryptological system. This is Derrida and Polman. This has led to the emergence of a bottom-up panpsychism as an alternative framework to physicalism, which notably Tononi 2012, which argues that the universe is pervaded by consciousness to the lowest level. The challenge here is the combination problem, or accounting for why the primitive elements combine in a particular fashion to give rise to a conscious personhood. Consequently, the top-down approach, namely cosmopsychism, which argues for the existence of one absolute consciousness and its dissolution into multiple forms, its differentiation into multiple forms, has gained traction. Cosmopsychism has a long history in the Indian theistic traditions, such as Shaivism, Advaita Vedanta, and arguably in the Gita and in Chaitanya Vaishnavism. This paper will identify the lessons that can be learned from Shaiv cosmopsychism and see how they can inform contemporary approaches within the philosophy of mind and consciousness. Some attempts have been made within the panpsychism circle to derive foundational principles from non-dual Shaivism, notably Iteshani. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correct, but Iteshani's paper is on this, 2022. And my talk is primarily a response to this paper. However, the understanding of Kashmiri Shaivism, the text and the metaphysics remains cursory in these otherwise necessary and productive attempts. This paper intends to augment the concept of cosmopsychism within contemporary philosophy by attending to the responses within Kashmiri Shaivism to 3 interdependent problems. First is the problem of individuation, or as to the relationship between the one primordial unlimited consciousness and other determinate beings that exist within this consciousness. Second is, how does Shiva, or the absolute consciousness, how does Shiva as the absolute subject grounds the ordinary cognition or reflective awareness? We'll come to what reflective awareness means. And third is, how does one understand or interpret the differentiation of absolute consciousness into multiple forms of reflective awareness, which is, why does the absolute consciousness choose to manifest itself in a differentiated form? These three questions are interrelated, and they, like, the second follows the first and third follows the second. Additionally, the paper wants to foreground certain questions which arise in taking recourse to Kashmiri Shaivism for cosmopsychism, and chiefly among them, the nature of idealism that Kashmiri Shaivism subscribes to. So, I'll speak briefly on the affinity between Kashmiri Shaivism and cosmopsychism. The non-dual Kashmiri Shaiv metaphysics posits the sole existence of an undifferentiated, infinite, absolute consciousness, which is fundamentally primordial and pervasive. All other beings and things are a manifestation of this absolute consciousness to itself, and thereby in a relation of ontological dependence with it. Shiv Drishti, one of the first non-dual Kashmiri Shaiv texts, pronounces unabashedly that, quote, Shiva, whose essence is consciousness, is the only reality. Even in the basest object, the whole nature of Shiva is present, unquote. And that, quote, all manifested things and subjects are states of Shiva, unquote. The self of all things is one and only, which is Shiva. There is nothing outside it. This panpsychist viewpoint finds its solid foundations when the scattered insights of Shiv Drishti are systematized by Utpal Dev in his treatise Ishwar Pratya Bhinna Karika. I'll refer to it as IPK, which is relevant for us with respect to the question of cosmopsychism. IPK posits, quote, a single dynamic subject that unifies and animates the discontinuity of reality and constitutes the substratum of every limited subject, as well as of every form and activity of everyday life, unquote. And it does so by demonstrating that it is impossible to account for ordinary experiences in a sort of idealistic framework without this absolute subject, which is Shiva. This absolute consciousness in its highest form is solely the I, the principle I. And such claims within Kashmiri Shaivism ground the pull towards it as a fecund source for the theory of cosmopsychism. Now, this notion of absolute consciousness or the pure I raises difficulties as to how to account for the diversity of subjective experiences among different subjects. How can one person be happy while the other is sad or angry when both are manifestation of one and the same consciousness? It has been argued that the existence of distinct subjects with distinct subjective states at a single time is not a problem for Kashmiri Shaivism, since it does not ascribe to a kind of priority monism where the absolute is a whole comprised by different but coordinating subordinate parts. This is, I'm phrasing Shani. Taking a distinctive position which Shani calls generative monism, Kashmiri Shaivism posits a hierarchical vision of descending planes of consciousness, which are different from each other and relatively independent. The world of ordinary sentience is characterized by what Shaiv texts call reflective consciousness, whose essence is that of grasping an object external to it. This level, where the cognition is bound to the apprehension of object as outside it, as different from itself, is a lower level in the Kashmiri Shaiv hierarchy. The higher plane is that of the pure, all-encompassing I, which is ontologically prior and crucially distinct from the above mentioned lower level. In this absolute unity, quote, all principles are contained, though in a state of complete dissolution, unquote. The approximation to this absolute non-dual state in Kashmiri Shaiv praxis, which follows from the recognition by the finite subject of one's own Shiva nature, which is Pratyabhinna, is characterized by both entering and being entered by Shiva, which is Tat Samavesh. This state remains the desired goal of the practitioner, of the Shiv practitioner. On this almost absolute plane, the apprehension of the external object dissolves into a kind of self-grasping, since one grasps the object and oneself both as concealed manifestations of Shiva itself. So there's therefore basically a ontological distance between the absolute consciousness and finite subjects. The absolute consciousness is not, as I said earlier, is not comprised by finite beings, but it exists in a transcendental form such that the finite beings, though derived from it, are distinct from it. The world of finite determinate entities is a manifestation of the absolute consciousness at a lower level, with the one consciousness existing at the same time in a transcendental form. The one is not the whole, but is rather the ground. And I'll come to the ground. The positing of this irreducible ontological distance between the absolute consciousness and finite subjects, and the relationship of ontological priority of the absolute consciousness, dissolves the question of diversity among different subjects, because each subject is rather enacting on a lower level the capacities of one without impacting the one as such. However, positing such an irreducible distance between the undifferentiated consciousness and ordinary sentience without explicating a mediation or an internal relation of unity between them runs the risk of rendering them completely foreign to each other. Alternatively, Kashmiri Shaivism stands out against the Advait Vedant with its affirmation of the illusory world of everyday appearance, which is Maya, as being ontologically real. Nonetheless, since, quote, even the basest object contains the whole nature of Shiva. This world affirmation within Kashmiri Shaivism is another major feature that makes it an attractive choice among contemporary philosophers. And this affirmation remains empty unless the distinct planes of consciousness are united with each other. So we have an arrow going from finite to infinite, which is that of ontological dependence. But the other arrow is equally important. What do finite entities manifest or make possible of the absolute? Or basically how the absolute consciousness, in addition to being transcendent, is immanent in them. Without the positing of an internal relation between these planes of consciousness, the cosmopsychist falls susceptible to Hegel's criticism of Spinoza and Shiva. He does the same criticism of both, disregarding whether the criticism holds for Kashmiri Shaivism and Spinoza. There's a useful benchmark there. And Hegel's criticism is that if absolute is defined as possessing all qualities which are not in finite beings, as simply negation of finite beings, then it amounts to basically an abstract and empty notion. The positing of absolute as the great whole that only is true, while the non-absolute beings stand in complete dependence on it and ultimately are non-being, amounts to only a formal unity. And this formal unity of absolute as pure light, in terms of its relationship with non-absolute, is no different from absolute as pure darkness. Kashmiri Shaivism, however, renders Hegel's criticism null by the following ontological framework of a unity of distinct planes of consciousness. The systematization of the mystical formulations of Somanand, which posit that this jar or any object is no less conscious than the cognizing subject, lies in the construal of reality as a hierarchy of planes of consciousness by Utpal Dev and the tradition after him, which is Avinav Gupta, Shemraj, and Jairath. The lower levels in this hierarchy are ontologically dependent on the higher level of consciousness, yet the consciousness at the absolute level, in addition to being transcendent to lower levels, is immanent in them. The difference lies in the fact that on the higher plane, the absolute consciousness exists in an unconcealed manner, as the undifferentiated pervasive consciousness, whereas it does so in a concealed manner in the lower levels. To this extent, the erroneous cognition, which is mired in subject object duality, is also only because of Shiva. The manner in which Shiva pervades the lower level of reflective consciousness is tied with the second question. The response to the second question within Kashmiri Shaivism as to how does ordinary cognition manifest the absolute consciousness employs two very crucial and powerful concepts. And it is a demonstration of the same, which is the ultimate aim of Ishwar Pratibhinna Karika. The first concept is light, prakash, which is luminosity, the source of all manifestation, as shining, quote, the basic fabric, the founding structure of reality, unquote. All manifestation of objects and beings which comprise cognition owe themselves to the luminosity of light. IPK claims a strong idealism where anything that is outside light cannot be, quote, manifested to consciousness or established through inference, unquote. Kashmiri Shaivism stands in union with the Vinyanvadins in holding cognition as manifestation of consciousness to itself, and with the assumption of external reality as unnecessary. The nature of object is light itself, otherwise it would be insentient, jada. Herein lies the association of consciousness to objects, for they could not manifest themselves if they were completely different from consciousness. The other crucial move Kashmiri Shaivism makes is that to insist reflective awareness, vimarsh, is the essence of light. The reflective awareness, which is the second concept, essentially implies that grasping an object is always an act of self-grasping. To illustrate it in a representational schema, each cognition of the object involves taking the form of that object and becoming aware of itself from within that form. This reflective awareness or inner awareness, which is Swayam Samvedana or Swayam Samvritti, shared with the Buddhist, rests on a phenomenal self-reflexivity of knowledge. To know is to know one knows, and so on. The I that is reflective awareness is crucially held by Kashmiri Shaiv thinkers to not be a mental construct, which would therefore be false as per the Buddhist criticism. But they believe that even though the self-reflective awareness of I is informed by discourse, is something else. It's rather it's not completely, even despite being discursive, it's something which is far more fundamental and foundational than discursive knowledge. But the dynamism, which is self-reflexivity, inherent in limited consciousness, which is the mark of the pervading infinite consciousness, lies in its, quote, power to grasp itself not only subjectively in the form I, but also objectively in the form this, displaying its radical power to become even its other. Therefore, the absolute consciousness, descending to a lower level, taking the form of duality, where a subject apprehends an objective reality, that this is a jar, is nothing but its dynamic power. Consciousness as such is pervaded, or rather defined in Kashmiri Shaivism, by this dynamism to take the form of the other. The manifestation of absolute consciousness in a concealed form as limited beings is also analogously the manifestation of its higher dynamic power and freedom, of the dynamic power of the absolute consciousness. The absolute consciousness undergoes differentiation by its free will, which is called Swatantra Shakti. Therefore, Kashmiri Shaivism and the wider world of Tantra sees this inner relation between planes of consciousness as finite beings harnessing the power, the Shakti of absolute consciousness, which is, when we come back to the generative monism, the relation therefore is not that the whole is comprised by these, but it's more that the finite beings are sort of harnessing the power, the dynamism of the absolute consciousness. And the categories which ground the Kashmiri Shaiv metaphysics are power, freedom, and beatitude. It is dynamism and active which is also free nature of consciousness at every level, which is foregrounded as essential in Kashmiri Shaivism. Therefore, one cannot agree with Shani's characterization of Kashmiri Shaivism as objective idealism, which is probably because of the ontological affirmation of the objectivity of the world. Given that this world itself is seen as a manifestation of Shiva as the absolute subject, this description seems inadequate. The objective reality is upheld as true at one level, at the lower level, but simultaneously annulled as nothing but the self manifestation of consciousness on a higher level. The idealism within Kashmiri Shaivism posits a will and a subjectivity at the foundation of objectivity, except that this will is primordial to every other will emanating from finitude. So I think this will should not be interpreted as the human will. And given that this differentiation results in our objective world, it implies a creative aspect to this dynamism. The placement of a primordial will at the foundation of objectivity of the world, highlighting its creativity, suggests a midpoint between objective and subjective idealism. And moving to my last section, it's mostly questions that I'm grappling with. So I have nothing substantial to offer as such. But therefore, the lesson which Kashmiri Shaivism holds for cosmopsychism is that the latter can only be grounded within an idealistic framework, holding the self-reflexivity of knowledge and cognition. Besides, Kashmiri Shaivism is able to uphold the validity of everyday world, despite holding the validity as well as the erroneousness of everyday world, is on the account of positing the absolute consciousness as ultimately an absolute subject, as a free sovereign subject. This is in addition to accepting the quote presence of language at the heart of every cognitive activity, unquote. Therefore, the Shaivites can posit a continuity between the moment of direct perception and the consequent conceptual elaboration, which is Vikal, which is necessarily connected with language, which the Buddhists absolutely deny. For the Buddhist, the moment of direct perception is discontinuous with the later conceptual elaboration. And I mean Dignag and Dharamkirti particularly. It is the internalization and molding of the grammarian's emphasis on the absolute nature of word, vak, that Utpal Dev can posit a continuity between the layers of consciousness permeating with varying levels and states of play of absolute subject, of states of play of absolute consciousness. Only on the account of these presumptions can the ordinary world be considered as ontologically inferior and yet a creative act of free will on part of absolute consciousness. Ultimately, the innovation of Kashmiri Shaivism is to posit a generative schema perched on the height of non-duality, such that it can internalize its opposite in a manner that its validity is retained while being simultaneously cancelled as subordinate. This machinic schema of a hierarchy of planes also raises theoretical problems to further think about. The central features highlighted in Kashmiri Shaivism, if any, are freedom and beatitude. And yet freedom is defined precisely through the free descent into non-freedom. It's the free descent of absolute consciousness into a limited form, which is defined as freedom in Kashmiri Shaivism. And similarly, beatitude is so defined that the absolute resting in itself nonetheless descends into lower forms. And this descent doesn't take out of lack, but out of love. There are interesting parallels with Plotinus here. Unfortunately, Professor Purushottam is not here. But apart from the contradiction inherent in above formulations, the broader context of Kashmiri Shaivism, the broader historical context of Kashmiri Shaivism also raises interesting problems. The hierarchical mode of planes of consciousness cannot be divorced. I'm not arguing for a relationship of identity, but it cannot be divorced from the counterintuitive Shaiv insistence on preserving social hierarchy while arguing for the presence of Shiva in everyone. And I'll offer a quote from the Shakt author Jairath. Inwardly Shakt, outwardly Shaiv, and Brahminical in his mundane observance, he should hold on to what is essential like a coconut, protecting its juice inside its flesh and hard shell. That there's a relation between the two can be seen through various mapping which exist linking the ontological to social, but also ontological to linguistic, This is Abhinav Gupta's like quadripartition of word and language, uh, basically the word and the system. The theoretical system which emerges with and after Utpal Dev is the outward turning of an otherwise secretive esoteric movement which reveled in transgression of Brahminical purity. These thinkers are therefore responding to the challenge in their time to provide a respectable place to Kashmiri Shaiv Tantra systems while subduing and reconceptualizing their antinomies. The assimilative hierarchical system, therefore, is born of this requirement, such that it can always assimilate and contain its negation. But there are still interesting questions which arise, which is to think this contradictory freedom or the contradictory non-freedom, the transformation into which is the free play of the absolute consciousness. And one can say like it's the problem of how to think the absolute and limit at the same time. And the only parallel which comes to my mind is Hegel, where basically he moves it to the self-reference of the negative, uh, which is interesting. But like I think manifestation in Hegel moves to a certain kind of world history, and I think it leads to what Professor Pushottam was highlighting, like in India at least, the emergence of Ram as the central figure and India as a civilization, the nation state, and so on. I feel there is a different kind of manifestation, a positing of a manifestation which can be understood from Kashmiri Shaivism, which through the relationship between freedom and limit, that freedom is limiting itself, the absolute limits itself in exhibiting its freedom. Thank you.